Go and let's see. Great. Well, welcome everyone to the GCAS public lecture series. We provide public lectures from expert professors in various fields of study. And the objective of the public lecture series that GCAS provides from our sponsors includes the topics include folks like what Sarah Churchwell is going to be speaking about today. We have a Nobel laureate coming up next month, Pulitzer Prize winners. And again, the objective is simply to provide the public with information, given especially the state of misinformation that abounds greatly for us today. And I think what's special about our guest, Professor Churchwell, is that her work, although considered an academic work, also, in my opinion, combats coordinated campaigns to distribute misinformation. And so we are privileged to have with us Professor Churchwell. I'm going to introduce our guest, and then we will have our guest speak for 45 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A. So feel free to type in some questions you might have. On to the introduction. Okay, so our guest today is Professor Sarah Bartlett Churchwell, who actually comes from the Windy City of Chicago in the United States, and who is currently a professor of American Literature and Public Understanding of the Humanities at the School of Advanced Studies, the University of London, United Kingdom. Her expertise is in the 20th and 21st century American literature and cultural history, especially pertaining to the 1920s and the 1930s. She has appeared on British television and radio and has been a judge for many prestigious book awards, including the Booker Prize, the Baillie Gifford Prize, the Women's Prize for Fiction, and the David Cohen Prize for Literature. She's in fact been shortlisted for what's the prize you've been shortlisted for? I'm so sorry, I didn't.
It's okay. No. I think it was. I think I've just been promoted. I was longlisted. I was longlisted for the Orwell Prize for journalism last year, and I think that must be what you said. I did not get shortlisted, so we must not misrepresent.
Okay, yeah, that's right. We have to distinguish between long and short. That's in key.
We're not doing
concept.
Misinformation, right?
No, that's right. Perfect. Yeah, I appreciate it. That's why I wanted to ask. So the Orwell Prize for journalism, which again tells us about the breadth of the work that our guest does throughout the spectrum of academics as well as public intellectual. And she's also the director of the Being Human Festival and the author of 4 books, one of which is forthcoming. And I'll list those books. And this is a really interesting one for me and perhaps for you, The Many Lives of Marilyn Monroe. And that's a really interesting book that you came out with first. I wonder if that was your dissertation. We'll maybe get onto that. And then the second book is Careless People, Murder, Mayhem, and the Invention of the Great Gatsby. And the third book, Behold America, A History of America First and the American Dream. And then forthcoming this summer is The Wrath to Come, Gone with the Wind and the Myth of the Lost Cause. And that's forthcoming with Bloomsbury. Finally, in April 2021, that's just last year, she was longlisted for the Orwell Prize for Journalism. There, I got it.
Let's get that in twice.
Yeah, okay, why not? Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us today, and the floor is yours, and a big hearty welcome to you. Thank
you so much, and thanks for that very, very generous introduction, including, as we said, advancing my award. It's really, really nice to be here, and I really I was really pleased to be asked in particular to talk about the research that comes from my last book, as you said, Behold America, and what I've been doing since that book is actually a history of the way that 2 phrases, America First and the American Dream, intertwined in American cultural and political life. And because of that, and because of some of the constraints that I was working with, I couldn't do as full and comprehensive a history of America First on its own in that book, because I had to leave space for the American Dream so that we could tell that story together. So what I want to do today is draw on some of that research from Behold America, but also I'm going to be bringing in some stuff that's not in that book. There's also some stuff that I found since then, because the archives keep expanding. We keep finding, things keep getting added, and it becomes easier and easier to find things in the mass archive, which used to be, really prohibitively difficult. So, so I'm going to add some stuff, augment, expand a little bit, but basically this is a whistle-stop tour of the political history of a slogan. And so I'm not going to talk about the political parties very much. I'm going to refer to them, obviously, but I'm not going to be talking about the kind of political movements. I'm just going to be tracing how this phrase has been used in American life since it emerged. So here we go. The political history of a slogan, America First. When Donald Trump started using America First as a slogan in 2015, and then during his campaign in 2016, commentators were really concerned. They felt that it was a phrase that had very dubious origins, and almost uniformly, they said that this phrase began with the Second World War. So there were kind of headlines all over the media saying that this phrase, America First, was invented for Nazi sympathizers, and that it comes from the Nazi era, and that it was about appeasement, and that it had this terrible patina of anti-Semitism as well. Now, none of that is wrong, except to say that it started there, because that is not where the phrase America First originates. It certainly has that history, but the phrase itself is much older, as my research has shown. And so although we have tended to focus our conversation around America First on the early 1940s, the America First movement that is referred to there was, and I'll come back to this, so I'm just going to refer to it now, and then I'll come back in more detail later, but associated with Charles Lindbergh and the so-called America First Committee of 1940 to 1941. And so so even as eminent a historian as Timothy Snyder, of whom I'm a big fan, don't get me wrong, but it was kind of the understood position, the kind of received wisdom on America First, was that it began in 1940 and then indicated a kind of nostalgia for the period before 1940, before America had entered World War II. But as I'm going to show, it actually is a much, much older phrase than that. The earliest instance that I've found to date actually goes back to 1855, so a full century earlier. And it looks as if the phrase America First, and I should say again, I'm looking here in a political context, right? So obviously the phrase America First appears all over cultural discourse, but in a political context as a slogan, it appears, the first one that I found, which doesn't mean there won't be earlier ones, but the earliest one that I've found is 1855. And this is the original nativist movement. They also called themselves the Native American Party, which is confusing to us today because, of course, we use Native American to mean indigenous people. They meant native-born American, and they were differentiating themselves from immigrant communities and from naturalized, well, they didn't have naturalization in the same way at that point anyway, but so basically from immigrant Americans, and talking about being native-born Americans. And they began using this slogan, America First, to defend against what they described as the threat of foreignism. So they said, I'm for America First. And of course, it has that implication intuitively of I was here first, and I get to say first what America is. I'm for America First, and I don't want all of these foreign elements coming in and telling us what to do. That is basically how it was used in the 1850s, and it has had a remarkably consistent set of kind of values and attitudes associated with it in the 170 years since then. Most phrases evolve, right? We mentioned the American dream at the top of this talk. The meaning of the American dream has shifted dramatically over the course of its life. And one of the things that's so interesting to me about America First is that it's remarkably stable across American history. But it seems to begin in 1855 with the original nativists who were objecting to the waves of German and Irish, in particular, Irish immigrants coming in, fleeing famine, fleeing war, and they were particularly fomenting or accused of bringing in Catholic plots. So it all provoked anti-Catholic hysteria and anti-Catholic violence. And so the fear of foreignism at this time is often cast as specifically against Catholicism and Irish Catholicism or Roman Catholicism. So part of the anti-Catholic conspiracy thinking and the anti-Catholic plots of the 19th century. And you see America First start to get used in that context. And at that point, it started to gain a little bit of traction as a political slogan. It certainly didn't become a kind of national slogan or anything, but people started to use it to indicate these ideas, and particularly to indicate a resistance to foreignism, to immigrant communities coming in, and a suspicion that foreign elements were trying to control American life. So there was a long-standing suspicion that the British throughout the 19th century didn't really want to relinquish their colonies, and that they had various kinds of plots and machinations to try to hang on to America or to regain it. And some of the economic protectionist arguments that developed at the end of the 19th century in America were also kind of caught up in this idea that the British economic interests were being used against American economic interests. And again, they started to use the phrase America First in those debates to argue against what some saw as unwarranted British influence in American life. And at that point, America First became associated with the Republican Party. By the 1880s, we can see evidence of it being used with local Republican parties, not yet as a national slogan, but local Republican parties were using it, and pretty consistently. So of course, this is the party of Lincoln, but 20 years after Lincoln's assassination, and the Republicans are starting to associate themselves with protectionism and anti-free trade, and they use America First as a way to express those sentiments. It's a catchphrase, it's a shorthand, right? And in particular, it evolved into, there were a couple of versions of it, not just America First on its own, but there became a slogan that was America First, Last, and Always. And then sometimes there were different versions of that. So America First and Always, or America First and the World Afterwards, which I'm particularly fond of. And those are from the 1880s and 1890s. The slogan became more and more popular, and you start to see it in the political discourse of the time: America First, the world afterward. So you can hear how isolationist that sentiment is. And as I say, it's very much in the purpose of expressing economic protectionist interests as well. Sorry, I'm just pulling up my notes. So that's about how the phrase starts to gain traction, and it remained in use, but as I said, not in widespread use until something happened, which was that in 1915, President Wilson used the phrase America First in a speech to the Daughters of the American Revolution, which is itself a nativist organization. I don't want to offend anybody who's currently a member, so I'm not making comments about what it's like now, but at the time it was a nativist organization, and he was addressing them in 1915. Now, of course, by 1915, Europe is embroiled in the First World War, but the United States was still neutral. And one of the reasons that the United States was still neutral was because the immigrant communities were at conflict about which side of the First World War they would want to come in on. The recent Irish immigrants who had, in either themselves or their parents' generation, had fled the conditions created by British rule, did not want to come in on the side of the British Empire. And they certainly didn't want to do that after 1916 and the Easter Rising. So you have a big voting bloc of the Irish who are absolutely adamant that they're not going to come in a war on the side of the British. And then you similarly have recent German immigrants who don't want to come in and fight against the Germans. And so there are all of these conflicting tensions and very strong senses of personal attachment to to the old world, to the old countries, because in many cases, of course, these people's families still lived in the old country. So again, there's the sense that if you're fighting a war with them, you're literally going to side against your own family. And so you can understand how that was such a difficult and it was a tight wire act that the president had to navigate. And he used the phrase America First to do it in a national speech in which he urged immigrants to put aside their loyalties to their old countries to the old world, and to declare themselves for America first. So it basically became a kind of loyalty test. He said that foreign-born citizens needed to demonstrate to people that they were for America first and that they didn't have dual loyalty. And of course, dual loyalty is an old canard that has always been and continues to be a slur that is thrown, an anti-Semitic slur that is thrown against Jewish people, suggesting that they have a higher loyalty to their tribe, or in some cases to money, or there are other ways in which that anti-Semitic slur is construed, but the trope of dual loyalty is baked into it, and the trope of dual loyalty was also baked into anti-Catholic hysteria because it suggested that Catholics had a higher loyalty to the Pope rather than to the American government. So all of this calls people's loyalty into question and foments xenophobia, and particularly anti-immigrant violence. And America First became the way that Wilson was trying to talk about, trying to kind of thread the needle. But with the phrase America First, he suddenly failed to thread the needle, and it kind of triggered this explosion of xenophobic rhetoric and anti-immigrant rhetoric. And the phrase just took off. It became so popular that Wilson himself ran on it in his re-election campaign in 1916. But not only did Wilson campaign on it, so did his opponent. It was so popular that it had bipartisan appeal, and both candidates it was an America First election in 1916, and so Charles Evans Hughes ran on America First, America Efficient, but it's still the same thing. America First, America First. It was so popular that presidential candidates couldn't imagine positioning themselves away from it. And it continued to gain that popularity, or to hold that popularity through America's entry into the First World War in 1918, and then our emergence out of it. It was particularly picked up by William Randolph Hearst, who was isolationist himself. And by this point, he's very much kind of the Rupert Murdoch of his day. I mean, I don't want to overstate the parallels, but on a basic level, think Murdoch and you kind of know what you're talking about. And his flagship newspaper, the San Francisco Examiner, began to run America First above its masthead, and America First with an exclamation mark. So the news would come into Americans, front doors with America First over it. And it would be headlines about the First World War. So it morphed into a patriotic wartime slogan pretty easily. And then it kept getting kind of roped into each successive political movement or controversy or debate. So during the Red Scare, America First was pulled in to the debates to argue that we needed to put America first by protecting the country against a supposed Bolshevik invasion or a Jewish communist plot. Again, very much a supposed Jewish communist plot, which of course was the basis of the first Red Scare. So in 1919, you see lots of political conversation, cartoons, doggerel verse, songs, all of which are rhetorically using America First to defend against what were seen as these external threats to American democracy and American integrity. The Red Scare was one of them, but even bigger was the League of Nations. And in fact, Hearst used America First to spearhead his implacable campaign against America's entry into the League of Nations and against Wilson's post-war settlement, against signing the Treaty of Versailles. And he constantly hammered it home. We have to put America first. We cannot get into entangling alliances, which is a garbled version of Washington's farewell address. But it's a shorthand for isolationist sentiment. So over and over again, we have to put America first. We cannot join the League of Nations. We have to put America first. We cannot sign the Treaty of Versailles. And he would dragoon in anybody he could think of into his editorials and into the conversation. So there's an example in 1919 where he calls Walt Whitman the original poet of America First, and says that Walt Whitman would have been against the League of Nations, right? And I mean, this is nonsensical, but it's that is that kind of myth making that was going on here, and using America First rhetorically as a shorthand so that everybody knew what we were talking about. We were talking about isolationism, we were talking about xenophobia, and saying that we wanted all of these foreign elements. Again, it just is against foreignism. And however you define foreignism is kind of up to you. And so that's the only part of it that changes over time, is how is the foreign threat perceived at a given point, or indeed, how is it personified? Which communities are being scapegoated as the current foreign threat? But it will always be putting America first to defend against that threat. That's, as I say, through kind of 1918 and 1919. And then, and don't worry, I'm not going to do it year by year, but I want to kind of establish how popular it was at this point, well before the 1940s, where most people talk about it originating. So it was so popular that in 1920, Warren G. Harding ran on it as an America First candidate, and his campaign policy, his campaign platform, was 6 points of America First. And what he promised to do was to safeguard America First, to stabilize America First, to prosper America First, to think of America First, to exalt America First, to live for and revere America First. And then he would trot out these lines on the campaign trail over and over and over again. In fact, he made a very early gramophone recording, kind of reciting these 6 very empty campaign promises to revere America First, to think of America First. Like, okay, well done, you're going to think of America First, great. But it was everywhere. It was absolutely ubiquitous on the campaign trail. Everybody was talking about America First. And again, there are we have a campaign that is run. I mean, you can easily find it on Google if you look up either Wilson in 1916 or Harding in 1920. You'll see campaign posters and campaign buttons and advertisements and cartoons and Republican campaign songbook, and they wrote songs called America First. John Philip Sousa wrote an America First march. There was just kind of one after the other. It just was, as it was kind of saturating American culture. It became so ubiquitous by the early 1920s that people were no longer explaining it. They were just using it to express isolationist and anti-immigrant sentiments. Calvin Coolidge also sometimes associated himself with it, but not as strongly as the previous 2 presidents. By 1923 and 1924, it was so ubiquitous that there were journalists who were, there's one that I'm fond of, and I do use in the book Behold America, and because I think it so compactly expresses how ubiquitous the phrase was. A 1923 4th of July essay or column, where a columnist said, "America First, how many times have we heard it in the years since the war?" It's just sighing, like, oh my God, America First again. It was just everywhere. Part of the reason that it was everywhere at the time, however, was because alongside of this more mainstream political discourse around America First, there was a more, well, it wasn't actually fringe. There was a more surreptitious version of it that began to gain traction and power, and started to take off at exactly the same time. And that is the organization of the Ku Klux Klan. In the early 1920s, they had a resurgence. So, of course, they originated after the Civil War in 1866, but they were quickly wiped out during Reconstruction and then basically eradicated. But in 1915, exactly the same year that Wilson popularized America First in that speech, the Klan was declared reborn. There are complicated reasons for this that I don't have time to go into. And by the early 1920s, the popularity of the Klan was starting to really spread. As I said a second ago, people think of it as a fringe movement, but it wasn't actually. It was very, very popular and increasingly mainstream. And it was moving up from the Deep South into the North, and it spread through the mid 1920s. The Klan had various slogans. They were upfront about the fact that they were white supremacists. So white supremacy was one of their slogans. Race purity was another one of their slogans. 100% American, which should sound like that nativism that I was talking about at the beginning, because that's exactly what it is. It is nativism, although it's also strongly racially inflected in the United States because of what was called the one-drop rule, where the one-drop rule said that one drop of African blood, so any African heritage, made you legally Black and therefore legally subject first to the laws of slavery and then to the laws of Jim Crow. And if you had to be, if one drop, 1% of African blood would make you legally African or African American, then by the same token, you had to be 100% white, 100% Anglo-Saxon to be a full American citizen under the law. And so 100% American is another deeply encoded phrase. So they use all of these phrases at the same time in the early 1920s. And then the other one that they were using was America First. And in fact, the Klan put out a pamphlet. It circulated around the country in 1922 that had their ABCs. So what were the building blocks or their foundational principles, their ABCs? And the A stood, they said, for America First. That connection between the Klan and America First strengthened through the 1920s. Any of you who have looked around for any of the history of the phrase America First in the 1920s or have done any research into the Klan online have very likely come across a couple of very famous photos from upstate New York, from Binghamton, New York, in which the Women's Klan was marching, holding banners that say America First. And when Trump repopularized the phrase, people started to locate those pictures and to show that there is this dark and violent history to the phrase, because of course the Klan was a violent organization in the early 1920s. I mean, they still are. And in the early 1920s, African Americans were desperately fighting for the passage of a federal anti-lynching bill to try to make lynching illegal federally. And that kept failing. It failed again in the early 1920s. So the Klan is shouting that they're for America First while they're defending lynching and while they're engaged in lynching. And so for African Americans, America First rapidly became a deeply menacing, threatening phrase because it indicated the immediate threat of or reality of violence. At the same time, this is the American context, at the same time, of course, in Europe, we have something else happening in 1922, which is the rise of fascism. I don't have time to get into this, but just very quickly, I think it's really important, is that when Mussolini took power at the end of 1922, Americans started asking, what is this thing, fascism? What is this new political movement that Mussolini has invented in Italy? But as I say, the Klan was also just kind of getting going, and it had been eradicated. So some people didn't even know what it was. It didn't have the kind of the full, or I mean, people knew the mythical background of it, but they didn't know what this new version of it was about. And so they began in the American cultural conversation in the early 1920s, they began to define fascism and the Klan reciprocally. So if you wanted to know what the Klan was, they would say it's like what Mussolini's doing in Italy. And if you wanted to know what fascism was, they would say it's like the Klan in America. And so they used them to explain them to each other. And often they also used America First as a way to explain fascism. So they would say things like the American fascists call it America First. American fascists walk under the banner of 100% American. So the debates now around American fascism presuppose that the United States had no real relationship to the ideas of fascism or to a native-born fascist movement, a homegrown American fascism, until the 1940s, until Lindbergh and the America First Committee. But that's just simply not historically accurate. The record doesn't bear that out. They were already talking about native-born fascists in America and fascist organizations in America. As soon as Mussolini appeared on the scene, they started saying the Klan is a fascist organization too. Now, that's not to say that it's an accurate assessment. It's to say, I mean, personally, I think it is, but the fact that they said it doesn't mean that it's accurate, but it shows that the resonances were there and that people recognized the family resemblance, that it was that there was a very clear family resemblance from the beginning. And that's the point that I want to make here. So that popularity of America First and its associations with the Klan, and then broadly with the ideas of homegrown fascism, began to gain traction. So they say things like, America First represents the same ideas that Mussolini represents in Italy. I already made that point. By the late 1920s, it was so clear that it was being used as a code, and as a code for violence, and again for xenophobia, for intolerance, that some of the victims of Klan violence began to speak out against the phrase America First. And it's important to remember that the Second Klan was not only targeting African Americans, but it was also targeting Jews and Catholics and immigrants. It was also targeting anyone who transgressed against other kinds of whatever their doctrines were. So they would attack people who were having extramarital affairs, or they would attack. They certainly attacked labor unionists a lot as well. They were definitely part of a great deal of what their violence was actually a cover for anti-union, anti-labor violence. So it's a big, complicated story. But so what happens is they kept using America First as this code, and so their victims start to push back by decoding it. And there's an example that I'm fond of, because it means that we don't have to do the decoding, because they did it for us. And this was a rabbi who gave a lecture in 1927 and said, this is what America First means. He said, the people in America who shout America First mean, quote, America must be preserved for the Anglo-Saxon descendants, regardless of the ideals of America. So they understood that it was implicitly anti-Semitic, and that it was implicitly white supremacist, and indeed on the edge of explicitly white supremacist, because the Klan was explicitly white supremacist and Christian nationalist. The Klan insisted that it was a Christian nation, and that America First, a Christian movement, and that America First represented the real America, which they said was a Christian nationalist country. And again, that obviously then feeds into or supposedly justifies anti-Semitic violence. Throughout the 1920s, however, politicians, also mainstream politicians, continued to capitalize on the popularity of the phrase. So from my hometown of Chicago, the mayor in the late 1920s, who was called Big Bill Thompson, he has the distinction of being one of the most corrupt mayors in American history, which is saying something, but he was really corrupt. And he ran on his second successful mayoral campaign in 1927. He ran on an America First platform, promising to keep the British propaganda out of the Chicago public schools. There was no British propaganda in the Chicago public schools, but it should sound similar to anybody who's following the debates around the teaching of certain ideas in the United States today. The reason that he was kind of like British baiting, right? Like red baiting, he was kind of British baiting. And the reason he was doing that was because Chicago had such a high proportion of such a high population of Irish Americans. So it was pandering to anti-British sentiment in the Irish American community in Chicago, and it worked. I mean, that's not the only reason he won, but that phrase, that campaign slogan, was successful. And the phrase just kind of would refuse to die. So although it had much less traction through the 1930s, obviously, I'm not going to give us a whistle-stop tour of American history as well. We know that once we get to the early 30s, we're talking about the Depression, Roosevelt, the New Deal. So the kind of sentiments expressed by America First had less urgency, but they're still present. They were still very much there. And you still get politicians running on America First, local politicians running on America First platforms, promising economic protectionism in the name of America First, promising to fight FDR's New Deal in the name of America First, promising not to put Europe first and not to put the European bankers first, but to put America first. And again, this should sound really, really, really familiar. The tropes, as I say, are remarkably consistent. By the mid-1930s, America First got a little new, I don't want to say lease of life because the example I'm about to give is so horrible, but it had a little bit of a resurgence into the political conversation instead of these kind of scattered uses, where it started to get a little bit more attention in a focused way, because a rabid anti-Semite by the name of James True started an organization called America First Incorporated and began to call for pogroms against American Jews. And he called for all kinds of anti-Semitic violence. He was very crude and brutally specific about what he was talking about. I'm not going to share that here, but just say that he was inciting violence against Jewish Americans in the name of America First. And his rhetoric was so outrageous that it got him a lot of attention. And so there starts to be this, as I say, America First starts to gain some more traction at the time. And that was 1936, thereabouts. So by the time the America First Committee was formed in 1940 to keep the United States out of a European war, to not come in on the side of the Jews in Europe, as it was being represented by some factions, has a long and deep history that every adult in America had grown up knowing. They knew all of the connotations of this phrase because they'd been hearing about it since the early 1920s, since 1915. They all knew it, and it had been, as I say, been arriving on their doorstep on a Hearst masthead. It is like a Fox News slogan today. Everybody knew what it meant. So that's why now people sometimes think, well, how can you say that, why would people say that the America First Committee had to have these xenophobic and anti-Semitic and isolation, well, it was certainly isolationist, that's not disputed. But there are people who try to defend its isolationism as having been kind of politically neutral. But the point is that using that phrase is itself a dog whistle by this point. It's a very, very loud dog whistle, and it's a very, very deliberate phrase. And so if they had wanted to express something more neutrally isolationist, like stay out of the war committee, they could have done so. But they went with America First because they were dredging up. I shouldn't say dredging, because I would say they're still very much present, but because they wanted to call up all of these implications, all of these connotations, and certainly the organizers of it and the spokespeople. Now, the America First Committee was a very, very large group by the time by the time America entered the Second World War. The America First Committee was a very big, loose coalition. It had 800,000 members at its peak. So we certainly can't make blanket statements about why all of those individuals joined the America First Committee. And there were certainly genuine pacifists in it. There were genuine conscientious objectors in it. Socialists joined it. So there were lots of people who were joining it who were not kind of fellow travelers, who were not fascist sympathizers. But the point is that it also absorbed those fascist sympathizers and it legitimated them. And that point was made frequently at the time. Its critics constantly pointed that out, that it was lending legitimacy to far-right anti-Semitic conspirators like James True and the America First Incorporated organization that he had set up. What happened then was that in 1941, Lindbergh, who had become the spokesman for the AFC, gave a speech in Des Moines, Iowa, saying that America had to stay out of the war because it was being coerced into the war by foreign elements. And and he did this in the name of America First. Right? He's giving the speech for the America First Committee. And he says that the three elements that are trying to force the United States into the war were the British, the Jewish, and the Roosevelt administration. And there was an immediate backlash, a huge backlash, because people suddenly could hear that was an anti-Semitic dog whistle. They heard that loud and clear, that what that implied was that Jewish Americans were not real Americans. And he was instantly, the outcry was enormous, and it was explicitly and specifically against the anti-Semitism of his speech. That's the phrase that they use. This is not my language, but theirs. They said this was anti-Semitic. They said this is un-American. And the America First Committee began to distance themselves from Lindbergh. Even Hearst denounced, his newspapers denounced the speech as anti-Semitic and as un-American. And only if that was September 1941, just a few months later, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and America, of course, entered the war. At that point, the phrase America First became discredited as the phrase that had been associated with fascist sympathizers. And so once we were in an all-out war effort, and once American democracy was on the line, and all of that rhetoric started to build, and all of that wartime sentiment started to build, for the first time, America First became the bad guy rhetorically. So it became the opposition. It became actually, it was not only did it cease to be patriotic, it became seditious. So some of the leaders of the far right America First sympathizing groups and conspiratorial groups were in fact prosecuted by FDR's administration for sedition in 1944. And again, that brings America First back into the conversation. The trial wasn't successful, and it has all kinds of knock-on consequences, but it continued to keep the phrase in disrepute, which is the important thing for our purposes here. But it never went away. People didn't forget it. They still knew what it meant. So even though they talk about the fact that it was, one phrase that they used was that it was a slimy bit of anti-Semitism, and talking about Lindbergh and talking about the AFC, they're still bringing America First into the American political conversation so that people know what it means. There were attempts to revive it after the war. There was a politician called Gerald K Smith, who was, when he died in the 1970s, his obituary described him as America's most notorious anti-Semite, which I think isn't the kind of thing most of us would want on our epitaph. But that's how anti-Semitic he was. And he had once been Huey Long's kind of deputy. And then after the Second World War, he tried to start an America First party. So he began a political party that he called America First, announced that he was going to run for president. It didn't really get anywhere, but again, he kind of kept the phrase alive. And again, it still consistently indicated what it had always indicated. 20 years later, Barry Goldwater, of course, the Republican candidate in 1964, was described many times as an America First candidate by both his supporters and his critics. So as he became the candidate, people said, I'm for Goldwater because he's for America First. Senator Goldwater has long been an America First statesman. He believes in what I believe in. He believes in America First. So it continues to function as a shorthand. And as I say, for both Goldwater's followers and critics, it was not uncommon to describe him as an America First politician. That's 1964. And within a decade or so, America First and the Klan have begun to join forces once more with the form of David Duke, who of course was, still is, I would say America's most notorious white supremacist and most notorious Klansman. At that time, he was also the head of the Klan. He no longer is the head of the Klan, but he's never, of course, repudiated anything that it stands for. And as David Duke came on the scene in the early to mid 1970s, he came kind of bringing America First back with him, and again was described as an America First, as somebody who espoused America First type white supremacism. And he himself said that he stood for America First, and that he stood for white supremacy and was, anti-immigrant and wanted to keep America pure. And that he said, this was in 1976, he said, the white race has to act intelligently if it's going to survive on Earth, right? So here there iterations of what is now known as replacement theory, again, a very old idea. None of these ideas are new. The idea that the white race is under threat. And in fact, we could do a whole different lecture on race suicide, but no time to do that now because I've got to wrap up. So David Duke comes in, brings the Klan back, brings America First with it back into the conversation. And then within another decade or so, a decade and a half, Pat Buchanan was running for president on an America First platform, which began in 1990, and he ran throughout the 1990s, various campaigns associating himself with America First very much as his slogan, and again, his supporters said that they supported him because he was an America First politician. That's the 1990s. And then in the late 1990s, a millionaire, playboy, real estate tycoon by the name of Donald Trump decided to start toying with politics. This is in the late 1990s, and announced that he was going to join forces with David Duke. I'm sorry, not with David Duke. I beg your pardon. That's really important. With Pat Buchanan, rather, because he said he didn't like the way that the Republicans were catering to what he described as the right-wing wacko vote. And so he thought that he was going to kind of toy with challenging Pat Buchanan for the candidacy of the party that Buchanan had created, which he called the Reform Party, but had America First as its slogan. Trump stepped away from association with Pat Buchanan not long afterwards, and was quoted in the New York Times saying that he did so because David Duke was in that party and it wasn't the kind of company he wanted to keep, and because he thought that Pat Buchanan was an anti-Semite. This is, I think, an important quotation for people who ask what Donald Trump understands about the rhetoric that he uses and how people interpret it, to know it. At least in the late 1990s, he was very clear about what it meant. In 2016, when Trump announced his America First candidacy, David Duke also announced that he was running for the Senate. And he said that he was overjoyed to see, this is David Duke, said, "I'm overjoyed to see Donald Trump and most Americans embrace most of the issues that I've championed for years. My slogan remains America First." And I'm sure that everybody who's watching this will remember that then, Duke endorsed Trump. Trump only very grudgingly repudiated that endorsement. He had to be forced into it. He claimed to not know who David Duke was. He claimed to not know anything about white supremacism, never heard of him, new phone, who this, whatever kind of stupid excuse he could come up with. But again, as I say, the historical record shows that he knew exactly what he was talking about. And then Duke continues to associate himself with Trump to the point that a couple of days after Trump's inauguration in January 2017, so almost exactly 5 years ago today, on January 25th, 2017, David Duke gave a talk, he had an appearance on the neo-Nazi website Stormfront, in which it was in celebration of Trump's inauguration, and it was a lecture called White Revolution and America First. Which brings us to last year, to this time last year, when, of course, the US Capitol was stormed by Trump's supporters. And some of the people who organized that insurrection, there was a group called Moms for America First on Facebook, which was one of the biggest women's groups organizing to bring people to the Capitol on January 6th. There was a white nationalist called Nick Fuentes, who has been selling AF merchandise on an America First platform since 2017, I think. And his flags, he created his own logo, an AF logo, and his flags were being carried into the Capitol during the insurrection. And then in spring last year, Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz announced the formation of the America First Caucus, which they gave the initialism AFC, which is kind of familiar. And their AFC was restrictionist, nativist, and assimilationist. And they said it was about reducing immigration to protect the Americans who were here first, and that this would mean putting America first. Of course, when they talk about Americans who were here first, they're never talking about indigenous people, by the way, but we can maybe get to that in the questions. And then my final example, and I'll shut up and we can come to questions, comes from last week. On January 21st, 2022, there was a pro-life anti-choice march on Washington, D.C. called the March for Life, at which photographers captured people carrying the Nick Fuentes AF America First logo. So I'm going to stop there and open it up to questions. Sorry, that went a little bit long.
Thank you very much for that talk, about the genealogy of the slogan America First. Our guest, Professor Churchwell, has written on this topic and published a book recently. So thank you so much for that. It was a great genealogy. And I wonder if I took a course when I was at Duke from Stanley Fish, and Stanley Fish would argue rhetorically, if you can condense your message in a short, powerful phrase like pro-choice, et cetera, then you'll win the debate, or your chances of rhetorically winning the debate on a cultural front. And I wonder, America first, and I wonder, like, it's hard to be in America and say, no, you are against this idea of America first on a rhetorical level. And I wonder if you could speak to the power of the slogan itself, in itself, as a kind of signifier.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for bringing that up, and for bringing some textual analysis into my history here. Absolutely, look, one of the reasons why the phrase has worked in the ways that it has is because it has plausible deniability built into it. It is a neutral sounding phrase. And so everybody can always insist that they're just using it to be patriotic. And that, of course, we want to put America first. Who doesn't want to put America first? And if it had been used historically throughout American history in ways that were open-endedly patriotic, or even if they're jingoistic, right? Even if it's a nationalist slogan, which it clearly is, obviously, but even if it's merely a nationalist slogan, then it's a very different kettle of fish from this. But the thing is that that's why I think it's so important to recognize the consistency of the code. So if it meant lots of different things to lots of different people, then this wouldn't be a talk, and it would just be an absolutely meaningless phrase. And you can even think about the American dream as a kind of counterpoint, because the American dream isn't meaningless, but it's very elastic, and it can mean lots of different things to lots of different people. And so depending on the context, you will find it being used in different ways. But America First always claims that it's just an innocent patriotic slogan, and always carries all of this nativist, very specifically nativist, anti-immigrant sentiment with it, and all of this stuff around race purity. So it has worked as this very successful code, to your point. But I think that, where you say with something like pro-choice, it works really well because it seized the rhetorical high ground, as it were. Or pro-life. Nobody wants to be anti-life, right? You can't say I'm anti-life. So once they've framed the debate, you've lost. And that's, as you say, the kind of thing that Fish would be talking about. Because America First could be more open-ended, it didn't have to be that successful, because it doesn't seize, except that you can't say put America last. But its critics would say exactly that. They would say what that does, therefore, is it renders it meaningless, because no president is going to put America last. So why are we saying you're running on an America First slogan? Of course you should put America first. That goes without saying.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And actually, we do have a question from a guest who's watching this on our YouTube channel, Walter Smith. And he asked, do you know of if Ronald Reagan used the phrase America First?
It's a really good question. I have not yet found a kind of meaningful place where he does, but you're absolutely right to zero in on, you caught me in my missing 80s there. No, but I mean, it's certainly there, but it definitely goes much quieter at that point. And I haven't found any significant instances of Reagan using it. I would hugely welcome if anyone finds any, please send them to me. I will give you full credit, and would be very grateful for any, but I have yet to find any, and it's exactly the right question to ask.
Great. Maybe two more questions. And this question has to do, it's kind of a two-part question. One is, to what degree, if any, that you could speak to, and I know your expertise is narrow, limited in some respects, rightfully so, we're academics, but to what degree do you think America First plays into the rise, the rather kind of dramatic rise of the QAnon conspiracy, what people call the grandfather of all conspiracies, all culminated? To what degree does that play into it? And then my second part of the question is, with the potential imminent threat of Russia invading Ukraine in the East, and the debate over Ukraine and the EU and so on, to what degree is the platform America First is kind of anti-NATO right? And to what degree do you think that could potentially rhetorically play out if in light of those events? So two parts, is that okay? Maybe I should.
Absolutely. No, but they're deeply related, as you say. But I'll do the Russia and Ukraine first, because I think you're absolutely right. And you can see it play, you can imagine it playing out against NATO exactly the way Hearst deployed it against the League of Nations. It's the same thing. And of course, this is how Trump used it, was against NATO, right? He said he was going to put America first and pull us out of NATO because NATO they weren't putting our interests first. And so that's exactly it's the same argument, effectively, that they were making 100 years ago about staying out of the League of Nations, that it's an international cabal, that it's European interests, that they don't pay their way, that we need to practice economic nationalism to protect our own interests. And it's rhetorically, it's exactly the same argument. So I absolutely can imagine that being deployed. And, and I'm not going to take any bets against it not starting very, very, very soon, if it hasn't already. And again, people may be aware of instances that we haven't seen yet where it's already starting. I'd be surprised if it doesn't, frankly. To the point about QAnon, yeah, absolutely. So I think what you picked up on there is that there is inherently a stream of conspiratorial thinking baked into America First. And it's something I've been thinking about a lot. So I know it kind of came out at various points in the talk just then, because I've actually just finished an essay about that. Which will be forthcoming later this year. And I'll make sure you get a copy where I actually lay this stuff out and take it up to QAnon, because it does. So as you say, so QAnon just becomes this kind of master conspiracy theory that's a mashup of all of the previous conspiracy theories. And then America First has been sucked into that along with all of the other kinds of mess. So could do a whole other thing on QAnon. It's a big, messy subject, but America First is definitely there. And you're absolutely right that they all come together.
Great. Well, that's fantastic. Let's conclude here with kind of making a bridge to your forthcoming book, your most recent research, let's say, and it's entitled "The Wrath to Come: Gone with the Wind and the Myth of the Lost Cause." And I wonder, to what degree are you doing a genealogical work, and what are you focusing on in your most recent book that's coming out this summer?
Thanks for asking that, because as you know, when you're finishing this kind of big project, it's so at the forefront of your mind that it's really nice to be able to talk about it. So no, this one's not a genealogy, actually. It's in this book, I'm actually using Gone with the Wind as a way of explaining what's happening in America now. And also, I'm doing that thing of like kind of separating fact from fiction. So it's a work of debunking. But what I'm saying is that, okay, anybody who's even half educated knows that the representation of Gone with the Wind of American slavery is inaccurate, obviously. So I didn't write a book going, revelation, Gone with the Wind, inaccurate. No, you heard it here first. But what I am arguing is that those lies and distortions go much, much deeper than most people think, and including well-educated people. And I've done my kind of straw polls of and it's really, unless you're a professional American historian, people tend not to realize this. A lot of what I'm trying to draw together here, and also how much that their national mythologies, how much those mythologies continue to shape American political life today. And so Gone with the Wind kind of exemplifies that in ways that I think are not properly appreciated. And so I kind of try to use it as a kind of exemplary instance where so many of its themes actually speak to these issues that we're talking about. I can't get too specific without going off on a whole other thing. But so basically what I would say is that although you began by saying Marilyn Monroe, did she come out of my dissertation? She sure did. That was my PhD. Good guess. But what they all have in common, of course, is that they're all about American myths. And that's really that's the space I operate in, is American cultural mythology. And increasingly, because of what's happening in American life, but also because of my own interests, that I'm moving away from the kind of iconic figures like Marilyn. Actually not moving away from Scott Fitzgerald, because that's my scholarly expertise, but more towards political culture and to these kinds of cultural discourses. So, but that's still kind of where I sit. So it may sound like a grab bag, but it's actually, there are some consistencies to it.
That's great. And we're here now, and I'm sorry, I want to just ask maybe another question, just while we have you, and thank you.
I'm not going to hang up on you.
Okay, great. But don't hit that leave button. No, yeah. So I just wanted to, on the tail end of your last response to the previous question, namely, America First and NATO. And I wonder about, obviously you're in London, about the Brexit, and if there was similar kinds of, there's a kind of import from America, this rhetorical strategy of making British first, and then hence you create a Brexit problematic. But here's, I guess my question would be, as an academic, so this is a kind of meta question about your profession and about how you live and understand your work and its impact on the public and on other academics. And so I wonder, as an academic, do you feel like there's this growing pressure to, or even a threat to producing accurate historical information and providing that to the public? To what degree do you feel like the institution of the academy is still resisting the kind of a cultural overtaking of, say, a fascist moment or these kind of America First uprisings from time to time? If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really important question. I think that, first of all, you're absolutely right. There was an attempt to get a Britain First movement, a rhetorical movement going during Brexit. It got a little bit of traction. It got a lot of blowback. It doesn't really work here in the same way, which, to my mind is all well and good, as you'll have gathered from the way that I talk about it. But it didn't play in the same way. But there was certainly the attempt. And so, yeah, the parallels are very strong. In terms of the academy and its resistance to these sorts of, the culture wars over history and this idea that somehow there's something objectionable in revising history. What I always say there is that that's what history is. History is, it's the past that doesn't change. History always changes because we ask different questions about it. That's what happens. So we ask different questions about the same, and also because we discover new things. So we find material that we didn't have before. And so we can answer different questions that we didn't used to be able to answer. And technology puts a spotlight on stuff that used to be in the dark. And so we can look at that and examine it. So anyway, so the idea that all of this is some kind of, sinister new way of doing history is just ludicrous. This is how everybody's always done history. It's what history is people telling stories about the past to try to understand it better, and try to understand society better. And that's what we do. We are certainly in a very, very worrying time where that is not, where that concept is itself under attack, and where it is not a shared presumption that, of course, that's what historians do. And of course, that is a valuable thing for a civil society and for democracy. So we're definitely in, and I hesitate to use this word because people are throwing it around all over the spectrum, but I want to use it very, very specifically. This is Orwellian. This is exactly what Winston Smith does in 1984, is he cuts out from the newspaper stories that are not flattering to Big Brother. Then Big Brother tells him how to change the story so that it aligns with their vision of, so that Big Brother's never made a mistake and Big Brother never gets prediction wrong. And that's literally Winston Smith's job, we're told at the beginning of 1984. And he takes the facts and he drops them down a memory hole so that everybody will forget them. And then you can rewrite history, and that's how you control, that's how you maintain power. You maintain this image of infallibility, because historians are there to say, you got this wrong. That isn't how it happened. Power is more complicated. There are other people here who matter. All of those voices, democratic voices that historians bring, not all historians, but that the practice of history is inherently democratic in that sense, because it enables us to bring in those voices and for all kinds of new voices to come in with different perspectives and to ask different questions and see different things about the past and to try to understand it in different ways. So what they're doing is technically and literally Orwellian. And so it is therefore profoundly worrying.
Wow. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank our guest, Professor Churchwell, for this amazing hour of explaining the idea and the genealogy and the history of America First as a rhetorical or slogan, and how it played out in the cultural wars throughout the United States. I'd like to thank our viewers. Thank you so much for being part of what we do here. And Sarah, thank you again.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right. Until next time, next month, join us for another live lecture talk by a Nobel Peace Prize winner in economics. Until then, be safe, and we hope that you all flourish. Thanks.